Hey, kids. Uh, so, as we continue learning about the early part of World War II, the part before the United States was involved, we read just yesterday about the beginning of the war, the invasion of Poland by Germany, and kind of how Britain and France uh, they declared war, but they really weren't committed to fighting. They were still trying to find a way out of it, which is why you had that weird period of time there from October of 1939 until June of 1940, where they refer to it as the phony war, where everybody was just sort of staring at each other, daring each other to make the first move. And the reason Germany was not moving was because they were waiting until they were ready to go, and then when they were ready, they went. Britain and France were still somehow hoping that maybe this will just all go away, and they weren't going to have to deal with it. So let's take a look here at the fall of France. This was shocking to the entire world because these countries that are going to fight here that we're going to read about today, they fought for 4 years in World War One, and neither side could really move the other until the very end when the USA got into the war. So for Germany to invade and then it just be over within a few weeks was uh, just blew everybody's mind, and they struggle to reconcile that. So let's take a look at it here. Follow along while I read. World War II, the fall of France, 1940. Iron hands on Scandinavia. Britain and France were not prepared for war with Germany. Even after months of preparation in the period of time known as the Phony War, they still were not committed to the fight. Their thinking was rooted in World War I. Britain and France could not imagine anything different from their experience of 1914 to 1918. Germany, on the other hand, prepared for a totally different war, one which Britain and France could not win. In April 1940, Germany invaded the Scandinavian countries of Denmark and Norway and defeated them within days. The British hoped to occupy part of Norway to use its coast as basis for its navy, but the Germans beat the British there. The failure to protect Norway finally drove British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain from office. Winston Churchill, who became one of the greatest leaders in British history, replaced him. And there you see a picture of Churchill. Chamberlain, he was sort of the symbol of this not ready to go to war type of thing. He gave away Czechoslovakia in 1938. Uh, you know, Churchill was the guy, and you see him in that photo there. Churchill was the guy that had been saying all along, you cannot bargain with a tyrant. He's just going to keep taking, taking, taking. So when he became the leader, finally the British had somebody who was going to stand up to Hitler. It didn't happen immediately, as we're going to see. It's not going to be what we're reading about today, but it's coming. The Germans took Denmark without much of a struggle. Norway resisted as much as possible, but was betrayed from within. The Norwegian Minister of Defense, Vidkun Quisling, was a Nazi and admired Hitler. He never gave any orders for the Norwegians to fight back. Norway fell easily. Ever since then, the term Quisling is used as a synonym for traitor. First blood in the West. Germany began their invasion of Western Europe by first conquering the Low Countries of Belgium and the Netherlands. These countries were so named because they lay below sea level. The Belgians and Dutch hoped that if they did not provoke Germany, they could escape invasion. They were totally unprepared for war and offered little resistance. Sadly, many German Jews who fled Nazi Germany now once again found themselves living under Nazi rule. Anne Frank and Marion Blumenthal Lazan were two such people. So Anne Frank, you're probably familiar with, picture of her right there. Marion Blumenthal Lazan was a Holocaust survivor that has visited Plano Middle School several times. She's written a book called Four Perfect Pebbles. Highly recommend that you read it. It's a similar story to Anne Frank, except Mrs. Lazan ended up surviving the war, unlike Anne Frank. Before the attack, Britain and France thought they had the French border well defended. The Maginot Line of forts faced Germany. The bulk of the French and British forces were on the Belgian border, and the huge, thickly wooded Ardennes forest was in the middle. The French were sure German tanks and vehicles could not get through the Ardennes, so they only lightly defended it. Hitler fought in the Ardennes in World War I, knew it intimately, and recognized it could be the gateway for Germany. Germany smashed into France through the Ardennes forest, completely shattering the Allied armies. By mid-June, the Allies were in full retreat or completely routed. The Supreme Commander, Maurice Gamelin, was fired and replaced with another aging World War I veteran, Maxime Weygand. Just like Gamelin, Weygand's ideas were stuck in 1918. He provided nothing to reverse the situation. Deliverance at Dunkirk. Now, what we're going to be reading about here, we're going to be watching a movie here in class that will kind of show you this whole story here. So pay close attention. Deliverance at Dunkirk. The Battle of France was already lost. The British army was cut off from the main French force and trapped with their backs to the English Channel. Knowing there was a good chance the entire British army was about to be annihilated, they made plans to evacuate the continent of Europe. The British army needed to get back to Britain to defend their own country against German invasion. If the army was taken, Britain would be defenseless. The British retreated to the English Channel and waited at the French town of Dunkirk for a miracle. The Germans surrounded the British, but then waited to let their air force, the Luftwaffe, destroy their enemies. The Luftwaffe made life terrible for the soldiers on the ground, but could not effectively control the air over Dunkirk enough to crush the British. Responding to emergency calls from the Royal Navy, ordinary British citizens sailed across the English Channel in everything from fishing boats to pleasure yachts. They courageously dodged attacks from the Germans and showed up at Dunkirk to rescue the British army. There you can see British soldiers wading out into the water to try and get on board those boats to get out of there, because if they didn't, they'd be taken prisoner by the Nazis. The British hoped to rescue 50,000 men, which would then have to somehow defend Britain against the millions of German invaders who would soon pour over the Channel. Sailing day and night and under constant attack from German warplanes, the Dunkirk rescuers were able to return 338,000 men to Britain. All of their equipment and vehicles were lost, but the army was saved. France is lost. With the British gone, France collapsed. The French asked for an armistice. Hitler accepted, but made them sign it in the same railroad car in which Germany signed World War I's armistice in 1918. The Germans entered Paris on June 14, 1940, and quickly occupied the entire northern half of France. The southern half was left supposedly independent. The French government retreated to the town of Vichy, and 84-year-old World War I hero Marshal Henri Pétain took over. He believed Germany had already won the war and hated the British for leaving at Dunkirk. Vichy France became a puppet state of Germany. This meant the Vichy government was not really independent. They would do whatever the Germans told them to do. Vichy France also controlled all of France's colonies in Africa and Asia. And we'll deal with that just a little bit, because those are actually the first guys that the United States has contact with when we get into the war against the Germans fighting in North Africa, of all places. Not all Frenchmen would follow Vichy France's orders, though. A French general named Charles de Gaulle escaped to Britain and told his countrymen by radio that Germany was still and would always be the enemy of France. He hoped loyal Frenchmen would not give up the fight. He said Pétain's surrender and Vichy France's cooperation with the Germans was not the only destiny left for once proud France. De Gaulle founded the Free France movement and continued to fight alongside the British for the rest of the war. And there you see the emblem of the Free France movement. You've got that cross in the middle. That was sort of the thing they would kind of draw in the dirt or write on walls. They called it the Cross of Lorraine, which would symbolize that France is not dead. Much to the surprise of everybody, there's still some Frenchmen that are fighting. They're not going along with the Nazis. So you ended up, for a big chunk of the rest of the war, you ended up with some Frenchmen supporting Vichy that were on the side of the Germans. And then you had some Frenchmen that were what they called Free French, and they were fighting still alongside the Allies. So you actually ended up at times with Frenchmen fighting against Frenchmen. It didn't happen too often, but it did actually occur. So we're going to continue on. We're going to see, England is by themselves. Great Britain is by themselves now, and they are trying to hold off until they get some help from the United States, from the Soviet Union, for whoever might still come and help. And it doesn't look real good for them at this point. They're still alive, but just barely breathing, and that's about it. But the British are tough. They don't give up. They didn't look real good in what we just read here, but they take care of business from here on out. All right, so we'll pick it up then.